Good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me in the back. You okay? All righty. I'm Barb Chisholm. My maiden name is Englebert. And for those of you that are looking at me going, I know her from somewhere, but where in the heck is it? I'm an emergency room nurse at the local hospital. Been that for 38 years, and I'm the one that walks around with the hat. And so I just changed hats for this occasion. Before I start and put myself into my great-grandmother's character, by the way, which is this lady right here. She's not a happy-looking woman. She had a rough life. I am going to tell you a little bit about the costume I have on. This is typical of what a Belgian peasant would have worn around the 1860s. Only difference is the shoes and the socks are not, because I couldn't find a pair of sabots or wooden shoes. The Belgians wore wooden shoes just like the Hollanders did. I have my pantaloons and I have an apron on. An apron was a wonderful commodity for immigrant women. They used it for a variety of things. They gathered it up and put apples in. They wiped children's faces. They did everything, including what we use them for, which is cooking, and we wipe our hands on the front of our front of our aprons. If you'll notice, this apron does not have a strap around the neck, and I thought that was rather different when I got it the first time around, and I found out that there is a reason. The reason being, it is not polite to meet guests with a dirty apron. So if the women would see company coming, they would pull the two pins, flop the front down, and it would cover up the dirty part of the apron, and so therefore you were able to greet guests. This hat I have to take off as soon as possible because it's driving me nuts. It's very a tunneled type vision. But this was worn by the peasant women in the fields. In fact, I can remember my mother picking stones with this. She put Noxzema on her face, and she'd put this on her head, and off we'd go to pick stones. It is made with the idea of keeping the ground and the wind out of your neck and the sun out of your face. It was built or made with different compartments. And in each compartment would be a wooden stay. And you would take the stay out and put it aside when you would wash it, and then put it back in afterwards in order to keep it clean. But like I said, that's the first thing that comes off because it's very disheartening. I sort of feel like a horse, you know, you can only see tunnel vision. All right, now I would like to let you all step back in time. I may be talking about the Belgians and the southern part of the county, but the stories are not all that different from any of your immigrants and your ancestors that came over. So we're going to travel back to about the 1870s. Good evening, everyone. My name is Emrance Gaspar. I'm the wife of Desire Englebert. I came to this country in 1856 at the age of 5. Desire was 15 when he came over, and we settled in a little area around Brussels. Now, we both came over for the same reasons. You see, Belgium is a very small country. It's about a quarter the size of Wisconsin. And between the years 1820 and 1845, there was a population explosion. There was more people than land. And my family was largely farmers, and we wanted a portion of this land, but we couldn't get any. In fact, it was interesting the way the inheritance went. You see, the oldest son got the land. The younger sons, if there were more than one son in the family, did not acquire any portion of land. They would have to become day laborers. Or in other words, each day go out and find a different job. So everyone was quite anxious to purchase a little bit of land for themselves. In 1853, just a few years before we came over, a gentleman called Constant Petronois left Antwerp with a small band of Belgians headed for the New World. We all had to gather the same thing. We had to have passports, birth certificates, immigration visas, $35 for every person over the age of 12, and enough bedding and provisions for at least 6 weeks. Once we gathered all of this, and once he gathered all of this, he was ready to leave Belgium. He left by the port of Antwerp and came over and landed in New York. Now, I understand later on there was a place called Ellis Island. It wasn't there at the time we came over. We just entered the port of New York and worked our way over here. They had befriended a group of Hollanders and were going to settle first in Sheboygan. They got there and found the best land was taken by the Dutchmen, and they couldn't understand them. So they went to Green Bay. By a quirk of fate, one of the band's children died. And a Walloon-speaking priest, Father Doms, was there. And he was telling them to come to where he settled in a little burg called Champion. Actually, it was called Oud-Primaire-Belge at the time. So they followed him there. They settled in, wrote glowing letters back to all my friends. A second wave came over in 1854. Oh, how happy they were to get news from the old country. But unfortunately, the second wave brought cholera. Soon, every family had at least 1 or 2 people die from the dreaded disease. They wrote letters back telling them that it wasn't all that glowing over here and life was hard. But by this time, Pa had gathered up all his belongings and was set to come over. The year was 1856. As I said, I was 5 and Desire was 15. Desire came over on a ship called the David Hoadley. There were 200 people on board, and of the 200, 60 died of dysentery when were burned at sea. Were buried at sea. Desire almost died himself. He went down into the hole of the boat to get potatoes. He had 2 buckets of potatoes in his hand, came up to the top of the ship, and was about to give them to the family, and a huge wave came over, knocked him across and out of the boat. He only saved himself by hanging on to the ropes on the side and pulled himself back in. When we finally made it to New York, we got as far as Green Bay. Pa and my sisters settled there for a little while and worked to get up enough money. We found a scout that was going into the deep woods. We followed this path. Or was it a path? Yes, I believe it was an Indian path. It was nothing like a road at all. And Pa kept saying, "We're going home." I kept looking around going, "Where's home? I don't see anything except trees." I looked up, I could hardly see the sky. We kept going deeper and deeper into the woods. Finally, Pa looked around and said, "This is it." I couldn't believe it. I saw nothing except more trees. Pa and my brothers made a little lean-to, a V-shaped teepee that we used for overnight. He went into the woods and got water from the swamp, built a little fire, and there we stayed. I was terribly frightened. I didn't know what to do, and I couldn't believe that this was what home was about. I could hear the animals in the woods, the noise of the wind over my head. Little by little, each day was a little bit better. Pa and my brothers were clearing land. I helped them as best I could. We planted seeds around the stumps and hoping that crops would come. I was the oldest daughter, and after a few years, it was my job to bring the grist to the mills in order to be ground. You see, we had to walk to Dykesville from Brussels. You had only paths marked by bark torn off of trees, and you put the grain in like a bag that attached to the back of your head and landed on your back. I was very careful and paid attention as to where I was going because I didn't want to lose my way. I would walk to Dykesville, have the grain ground, make the flour, and come back via the same way. I had heard many stories. In fact, a Mrs. Lamper almost lost her life because a pack of wolves were following her when she was coming back and just spared herself by running into the nearest cabin. Another lady lost her way and froze to death in the base of a tree. Little by little, we accumulated more land. We made our furniture out of timbers. Our table was a big tree trunk. Our doors were split wood, and our hinges were leather. The Indians that I was so afraid of became friends. They showed us how to tan hides, salt meat, and how to gather the different berries from the forest. It wasn't long before I noticed this good-looking man about two miles from my house. Oh, I thought he was handsome. His name was Desiree, and he could read and write English. He was a good catch. So little by little, we fell in love. And Desiree had it hard also because everyone was running out of money at that time, and the men would leave the women in the cabins in the wintertime when they would walk to the nearest cities in order to earn a little bit more money. Desiree walked as far as Chicago. Some walked as far as Milwaukee. Earned a little money and then would come back. Finally, we had enough money to get married. And we settled in this little village called Mézières, which was a small town between Brussels and Rosaire. Our first son was born, Eugene. We had a home, barn. We were trying to save up money for an oxen, and life was beginning to look good. I was so waiting for the Kermis. See, we celebrate, we work hard, but we Belgians like to celebrate. We like to dance and we like to drink our beer. And the Kermis was a weekly gathering in the fall of the year to celebrate the harvest. Kermis literally means church mass. So for weeks we had been baking pies, salting away pork. The neighbor had been making his homemade beer, and we were ready. But this year was to be different. You see, it was 1871. It had been dry all year. We were going to experience something I hope no one ever experiences again. It was a great fire called the Peshtigo Fire. Now, it wasn't really the same fire as Peshtigo. It happened to be a fire that happened at the same time. But you see, we couldn't explain it. So Desiree and the other men thought that it was the same fire, and the winds had brought over embers over the bay and set fire up over here. But that wasn't true. We later found out that it was a series of other things that happened. Before this was over, approximately 167 people would die in the southern part of the county. That's a rough estimate because many people hadn't registered and just wandered into the woods to set up or homestead their little area, never registering. So we were not real sure how many. 400 square miles would be devastated, and a path about 20 miles wide and 50 miles long from the base of the peninsula all the way up to just entering Sturgeon Bay would be devastated. In Peshtigo, by comparison, approximately 1,100 people died. Their news got out much faster than ours. There were more villages burned, and they could speak a better English. They weren't as desolate as the people in the southern part of the county, and we could only speak Walloon. In fact, there's only really one written dissertation about the fire in our area, and was written later on that year by Mr. Frank Tilton, that describes the fire at Williamsonville. Otherwise, everything was passed down by word of mouth. Now you have to picture the area in the southern part of the county was ruled by giants. The giants were trees. They were 5 to 6 feet in diameter and 100 feet tall. They literally ruled the land. In fact, if you could have taken and looked up on top, it would be like a green carpet, nonstop, with only little areas that were open where the settlers were. It hadn't rained in months. The winter before, hardly any snow fell. In fact, the logging operations in that area had to be stopped because the loggers couldn't get their wood and logs out of the forest, as they couldn't put them on the skis or on the sleds to bring them out. Everywhere you looked, there were sawmills. Sawdust was everywhere. There were piles of sawdust next to every little settlement. Slashings were all over. Slashings were the tops of the trees, that the branches that had been cut off, they were in piles. The roads were corduroy roads, which were logs laid this way. The sawdust was used to put on top of the road so the mud, it wouldn't be as muddy. They tried pushing the sawdust into the bay. That didn't help either. So the time and the conditions were ripe for a conflagration, and that is what happened. Trees had been burning literally underground. The peat moss in the rich swamps were all dried up. There was no water in the swamps anymore. You could walk for miles without getting your feet wet. It wasn't unusual to see giant trees suddenly erupt into flames, fall down, and the trees around them would erupt into fire. I can remember seeing something that looked like a serpent skittering along the forest floor. It was a row of fire going along, and it would hit a tree, and the tree would erupt into flames. It seems that the weather conditions were just right. The winds were very low to the ground, and it set up little whirlwinds. The whirlwinds would come upon a small fire. That fire would become bigger. It would join the next one. That one would become bigger until everything was out of control. It became a fire that no one could stop. It kept approaching. It also is said that because of the large amount of land that was burned and the fires that were so hot, it made up its own gases. And it goes along with what my neighbors and I saw. It seemed that along the tops of the trees would be great black balls of what looked like fire. And it would skitter along and then suddenly stop over a cabin and explode. And throngs of fire would settle down and burn that cabin. Air was so hot that you didn't have to burn. You would take a breath and your lungs would be seared. Many times people were not even burned. Some died just because of that. I remember them telling us about our neighbors that had children and they were found around a tree trunk as if they were praying. They weren't burned at all, but they must have breathed in the hot air. Now, Desire and I, as I said, was planning to go to the kermesse. For months, we had been fending off the fire. I had wet woolen blankets and put on the tops of the cabins. Desire had his pail of water, and he was going around putting out the fires around the cedar post. But he said, no, I don't think we'll be going tonight. You see, all that day, it had been like snowing, only the snow wasn't snow, it was large embers that were raining down on us. The air was so thick and hot, we had to put a wet cloth over our nose so that we could breathe. I went to bed that night and looked out at the sky. It was an eerie orange. It was like a premonition. I was really restless. I had Eugene in bed with me and I was tossing and turning. And suddenly, Desire came and said, Emerence, grab Eugene. We're going down into the well. I said, why? He said, the fire's approaching. I can't put it out anymore. We are going into the well. Grab a blanket. He grabbed a blanket and off we went. I wanted to gather up a few of my other belongings, but he said, no, no time. We've got to go. I took a last look around my beloved home and followed him into our homemade well. It wasn't very deep. We settled in the bottom, and an eerie stillness suddenly descended. Everything was quiet. Suddenly, a wind came up, a terrific wind, and everything was on fire. You could hear noises. You could hear trees falling. The wild animals came into the clearing, mixing with the cows and the domestic animals. Everyone had fright in their eyes, and they were running in all directions. We could hear the birds flying overhead, squawking, and there was a cacophony of noises and birds falling into the fire. And we heard the fire slowly approach. Suddenly it got to us, and we started praying, and you could hear it going over, and the embers were falling on us. We were passing Eugene back and forth so that he wouldn't get burned. We spent the night like this, praying. In the morning, we woke up and we got out of the well. Slowly we ascended and looked around. Everywhere we looked was devastation. Our home was gone. Our barn was gone. Yes, there were a few trees left, but they were just smoldering hunks. I looked over and here was our neighbors, the Koismans, coming over. They had nothing to do either. We wondered, it's October, what are we going to do? How are we going to fend in the wintertime? Who is going to help us? How are we going to eat? I remembered the garden we had planted. So I went into the garden and dug and got out the tubers, and we fended that day with that. Little by little, we started hearing other stories. As we waited for the help to come, we heard about a Prosper Jervis, who was in Namur. Now, Prosper was a very ingenious man. He didn't have any water to go with him, so he had a keg of beer. He brought the beer along. And he doused himself and his pig with the beer, thus saving himself. Harry Schudwar said his family laid in the streams. Others buried themselves in plowed fields. You see, if you got closer to the ground, the noxious fumes weren't that bad. There had been an itinerant preacher that had gone through the Belgian settlement, preaching that the end of the world is soon. Many people thought that this was it. Instead of escaping, they knelt down and prayed. We had a Charlie Rubens over in Rosaire. He owned a store. He went down into a well, decided, nope, that wasn't good enough. He got out and went out into the plowed field. He and his family were saved. If he'd have stayed in the well, he would have burned. There was another little village called Robinsonville where the original people had settled. It was said there that the Blessed Virgin had appeared to a little Belgian girl called Adele Bryce. She had built a small chapel there and was teaching the Belgian children about the Lord. As the fire approached, the people in that area started flocking to the chapel grounds. When they got there, Sister Adele led them in prayer around the perimeter of the chapel. In the morning, it was a miracle. The chapel and the grounds were untouched. Everything around them had burned. The fire's scope was large. It extended into Casco and New Franken and Red River and Champion, almost into Algoma and almost into Sturgeon Bay. But the worst loss of life in the southern part of the county was at a little village called Williamsonville. I understand that they erected a park there. It's now on Old Highway 57 or County DK. You see, Thomas Williamson and his brothers had built a shingle mill there. They had cleared anywhere between 8 and 10 acres of land. All of their family was there. Some of the workers, there were men, women, and children. There was boarding houses, a sawmill, a blacksmith shop, a store. But they were surrounded by huge trees. They had nowhere to go when the fire struck. For weeks, they had been doing the same thing that Desire had. They had been putting out the fire with pails of water. They had dug a perimeter around their buildings, thinking the fire wouldn't jump there. And some of them even built backfires, thinking a fire would not burn over the same territory twice, as it would have no fuel. They had appointed men to be lookouts on the neighboring post in order to put out the fire. They were pretty confident that everything would be all right. Nothing prepared them for what happened on October 8th. They were preparing for the night, and they were settling in. Suddenly, they could hear this roar coming up, and you could see a tornado of wind and fire advancing in this direction. Thomas and his family went running from home to home, alerting people to get up and get out and try to save themselves. First, they were concerned about property. Then they decided not to worry about that, just to save their lives. Thomas told his mother and his sister to put on the men's pants. His mother did. His sister was a beautiful woman called Maggie, and she did not want to do this, as she had just become engaged to one of the workmen at the mill, and she didn't want him to see her in pantaloons. Now, it is proven that at this time would have been a good thing for her to do, because you see, as the story goes, women burn faster than men because of their body fat and their layers of clothing. Once they got on fire, the fire wrapped around them like a candle, and they literally exploded. Sometimes no remains could be seen. Men, however, at that time of year wore woolen clothing. Wool, being wet, burns much slower, so they could put it out faster than the women could. Thomas was running through the settlement, and he was running in the direction of the potato patch. He ran across his foreman and his brother John. He said, "John, come with me." John said, "No, I'm going into the well." He and a Thomas Kyrene went into a well. 7 people went down into this well. Out of the 7, 5 lived, the top 2 died. One was a little French girl. They never knew her name. 35 people or so ran into a center of a potato patch. It was a plowed field. They settled in there hoping that they would be saved. They put the women and children in the center, the men on the outside with their woolen blankets. In the morning, they all were dead. Some so badly burned they couldn't be recognized. Some burned, one arm gone, one leg gone. The blacksmith was found a little ways from the pyre of bodies. He was holding his little girl and trying to protect her. They both were burned. Thomas's sister was found not too far away with a handful of hair that she had pulled out of her head because she was burning and the pain was excruciating. Another cousin could only be recognized by the jewelry that she had had. Miraculously, the jewelry hadn't melted because it was told that things literally melted in piles. Mrs. Williamson was heading for the potato patch too, but she decided not to join that group of people. She settled a few feet away. For some reason, she found 2 rocks that were close together, and she buried her feet in them. And for whatever reason, this gave her comfort. She squatted down, pulled a blanket over her head, and awaited her fate. Twice, she had to kick bodies away because they were burning at her feet. She spent the night that way. In the morning, she had survived. Her and her son were only two of the Williamson family that survived. They looked around, and there were 2 men that were burning, and they were trying to kill themselves by striking their heads against the rock. The pain was terrible. The thirst that they had was immense. They wandered to the well, and by this time the bodies had been taken away and the people had come out, and they thought they would drink that water. They didn't care what had happened. Mrs. Williamson wanted to get to Sturgeon Bay, so they began to walk. They thought they wouldn't have to go that far before they came to a settler. All the buildings along the way had been burned. Now, the good people of Sturgeon Bay had seen this fire approaching, and they were preparing themselves for what they thought would be a defense of their city. They got out their 1 fire truck, and they were waiting. But miraculously, October 9th, the rains came, and it helped quench the fire. So the people of Sturgeon Bay loaded up a buckboard and were trying to make their way to Williamsonville. They found out they couldn't get there. Trees were uprooted all over. There was sometimes 3 to 4 feet of ash. There were dead carcasses of animals all over. So they eventually loaded their supplies on their back and walked to Williamsonville. When they got there, they couldn't believe the sights they saw. Bodies everywhere. They began to bury the dead and number them. In Brussels, there were 200 people that survived on 4 loaves of bread. In Forceville, 44 people died. They saved themselves much like the people in Peshtigo because they went into the Anapi River. Everywhere they looked, they were wondering about relief. They didn't know where to go or what to do. There were a few cabins left, so there were 3 and 4 families living together in one cabin along with the livestock. They were afraid of typhoid and smallpox. We had trouble getting in supplies because the boats couldn't dock. The smoke was so thick on the shores that they kept running into one another. People were wandering into Green Bay and Dykesville and Sturgeon Bay, seeking medical help. Many people died later of kidney failure, infections, the pain. It was not unusual for us to see people scarred for life, walking around disfigured. But we did start getting relief. The good country of Belgium got together $5,000 and sent it over to their ex-kinsmen. There were articles written in the Door County Advocate, and I'd like to read a few to you. This was dated October 19th, 1871, and was written by Mr. Harris. Refugees from the burned territory have flocked into Sturgeon Bay, Little Sturgeon, and Dykesville. The destitution and suffering is almost too great to be realized. Supplies of every description are needed. There is a special demand for children's clothing. The people bear up bravely under their misfortunes and will go to work with a will as soon as they have the means. In places on the east shore of the bay, timber has been leveled for miles in extent. Parties commenced to chop out the roads. The roads are completely blockaded. Until this track is completed, no mail can be transported. At points on the road, fallen timber is piled up to the height of 50 feet. It was mentioned in another newspaper account, send relief. These people are huddled together in their fields with nothing to eat and just the clothes on their back. Winter is coming. They need food and shelter. Relief committees were set up in Sturgeon Bay and Green Bay. The governor of Wisconsin, Lucius Fairchild. Mrs. Fairchild was a friend of ours. Lucius was on his way to Chicago to give relief to the great city of Chicago, who also had a fire on this day. Mrs. Fairchild, bless her heart, did something unprecedented by a woman. She took over and commandeered a couple of the trains and sent them to help us and the people of Peshtigo. On October 26, 1871, the Door County Advocate wrote, the total loss will not be less than $500,000 and maybe as high as $700,000 or $800,000. The insurance will not exceed $40,000. You know, Desire told me an interesting article, and he wanted me to read this. There were editorials about people accepting aids that were not entitled to it. One editorial stated, and I quote, "Sir, there is a certain class who takes naturally to begging, and it seems that the more they get, the more they want. And this class has paid no attention to home since the fire, but spent all their time between Big and Little Sturgeon looking for relief. None of these folks lost their home, nor their clothing, nor any of their stock. They are a very greedy lot." And in the Green Bay paper, much to our dismay, a poor Belgian resident was accused of taking bedding and clothing from the destitute. All he was doing was gathering up clothes for his countrymen and holding it for them. Another article, and this really upset Desire. Someone wrote to the Door County Advocate that we really should do something about our cows wandering around the southern part of the county. We should be fencing them in. Now I ask you, how can we fence them in when we have no wood? no trees. Let them wander and find food. We will be doing that in the spring as soon as we find a way to do it. Another aspect, of course, was politicians. It was a voting year. The politicians were out in force. They were out handing out relief to us. They didn't pay any attention to us before because we were poor Belgians, but now suddenly they were out there handing out supplies, hoping for our vote. One person was running for Congress. He was from Oshkosh. He was to gather up money that the people of Oshkosh had given for relief. Instead of giving it to the people, he kept it. And in the spring, he gave it back to all the people that had written and given him money. Now he wants us to vote for him. Well, people of Door and Kewaunee County, you didn't pay any attention to us in our time of need. We're not voting for you now. It wasn't long before the relief was through. It didn't take very long. In fact, by the spring of October 21st, 1871, it was written that the people of the burnt district, which we are named at, are gradually resuming their old occupation of redeeming the forest and bringing back their farms to their old condition before the fire. Many of them are building rough shanties on their places in which they will pass the winter and get their places ready for plowing. The balance will have houses ready to move into next spring, and meantime will find work outside of their farms. On May 9th of the following spring, it was written, the fire suffers after having used up what supplies they still have and what may yet be in the local depot, will henceforth have to depend upon their own good right arms for their material aid, and except in a few isolated cases where help is needed, relief has ended. Now, as for Desire and I, we gathered up what we could and we built another house. Only this time, we were not going to let the fire get us. We built it of logs, but then we put brick around. It was red brick. If the fire came again, it would not get our home so fast. Our neighbors did the same. You can see many of these red brick homes, I understand, that are still out in the Brussels area. As I said, the only person that wrote anything about our calamity was a Mr. Frank Tilton. And he wrote an article in the Green Bay Press Gazette, which I would like to share with you. It related a story about Mr. John Gloverson, who was searching for information on his nephew. He supposedly had perished in the woods surrounding Forestville. He happened upon a portion of woods that was still smoldering, even after all this time. He sat down to rest and realized that there was a terrible stench. 15 or 20 feet from him were the remains of a large tree. Sticking out from this tree were feet and legs of a skeleton. The bottom half of the body was burned, while the top half was literally cooked. Doubtless the victim had been caught in the woods when the fire swept through, and having no other place to seek refuge, he had crawled into this tree, and he was literally roasted alive. Many such skeletons were found throughout the woods. We slowly redeemed ourselves. It wasn't long before giants again ruled this area. Only they weren't giant trees. They were giant men and women of indomitable spirit and a magnificent faith. Slowly we realized, with all the trees burned, We didn't have to clear the land anymore. The ash from the trees made wonderful nutrients for the soil. Farming was much better. Our crops were better. It took a long time for the birds to come back. But the following spring, things started to get green and the flowers began to rise. We looked around, thanked the Lord, and resumed our lives. Thank you. There are two excellent books here, and there are some that another gentleman brought, but these two are two that I use for references. Firestorm in Peshtigo and The Embers of October. They're at the local library. They are very good books. This one is Ghosts of the Fireground, and it sort of tries to explain the fire through the eyes of a firefighter, more modern explanation and looking as to why the fire spread and why it became so non-stoppable. This is a fire and ice book. One is about, I think it's probably the same as this one. It's written by the same author, Robert Wells. And the other is about the shipwreck. I'm not sure which shipwreck is that. It's called Fire and Ice. And these two little pamphlets you can get, or I'm sure he got it at the same place at the Peshtigo Museum in Peshtigo, Wisconsin. If you go there, it's very interesting. It's a small museum with a lot of stuff on Peshtigo. The more interesting is the graveyard out back because it shows a lot of the families that died and so forth. Interestingly enough, all of the research I've done, I can't find any tombstones around here that say 1871 on. I don't know if they were all made out of wood and deteriorated or what. There's none like the ones out in Peshtigo. Now, are there any questions?
What is the timeline between the time when these people were first attacked by the fire and when it was technically
done? There's different time, like anything else, the different people related it differently, but it happened in the evening, approximately between 9 in the evening and 3 in the morning. That's why so many people were caught unaware, because it happened at night and a lot of the people were in bed. But if you read the different articles, a lot of them will tell you that they had this weird feeling that something was going to happen. And so they were not sleeping soundly because it had been going on. It said literally you couldn't see the sun during the daytime because the smoke was so heavy. Any other questions? Yes.
You indicated, which I hadn't read before, that the fire from Peshtigo really was not a combination. Did they ever decide, or have you ever found what started the one on this side of the...
It sounded like, from what I've read, it was a situation where there were a lot of small fires had been going on forever, since about the 1st of September, and there were a lot of small fires. And it seemed that the wind that came through at that particular day was the same wind that was in Peshtigo, and it combined all these small fires into a bigger one, and then it became like a tornado force, and from there on in, a combination of the wind and the fire would just took off. But my grandfather always told us that it was the boards flying over from the Peshtigo side over to this side.
Well, of course, I think that's the fable that has been on for many, many years, that the wind and so forth blew the fire over to this side of the Door County side, which...
It's not, it was two separate fires. Interestingly enough, though, the fire on Peshtigo, there were fires in Michigan at the same time and in Minnesota. all on the same day, and it devastated a large amount of forests and lives, much bigger than the Chicago fire, much, much bigger. Only, needless, well, of course, Chicago was bigger, so you just heard more about that. And yes, sir.
I tried to research this and I've not found anything, but if you go into the Juddville area, along the cliffs, there are just huge stumps that are burned out and they've been there for a long time. Nobody knows anything about that. My question would be, were there leaps in these fires at that time, or were there other fires all along?
There were fires. That particular summer was so dry, there were fires periodically. I do not know of anything in Juddville. It could be that a fire was there also. In all of the reading I've done, most of it relates to it stopped just short of Sturgeon Bay. The city, where the city is now, it stopped just short of that. But it sure in the heck is a possibility that there were fires simultaneously, and because there were no people there, it wasn't, it wasn't told. Yes?
I noticed that the book, The Firestorm at Peshtigo, is on, they have that at the bookstore here in Fish Creek, and also Pastime Books in Sister Bay.
It's
a
a
wonderful
very good book.
Very well written.
Is this information being taught in the schools here, in any of the history classes locally?
I go, if the local schools ask me, and I have been going to Southern Door for sure the last 5 or 6 years. I do go, the Wisconsin history is taught about in 4th grade. And when they're going through the Wisconsin section, if the teacher wants me to come in, I come gratis and I speak to them. And the kids really are quite attentive. They really enjoy that. One little boy, which I was really sort of taken aback to, was I think it was at Corpus Christi. He said, "Oh, I know all about that." And I said, "Oh, you do?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Every October 8th at noon, we have to be quiet for a minute because his particular relative is burned in the fire." And I thought, after all these years, that part is still being carried on. I found that a little fascinating. Yes?
Concerning the water wells, do you know what the dimensions of the well was and how deep the water level was?
No, I don't. You have to consider that these wells were all hand dug.
Right.
And so they couldn't have gone down very far. The limestone was there, and I'm not into when dynamite was used. Maybe they used dynamite to get somewhat further down, but they couldn't have been very, I know the well that my relatives went into, I still own the original farm. And when I was a little girl, my father would show me where the well was, and it wasn't very big. We were cautioned not to go there because it hadn't been filled in, but it was like this maybe, not very big at all. So my relatives must have stood like this, handing their child back and forth. I can't imagine how terrible this must have been for these people because they had no place to go. All their roads were wood roads, so their roads were on fire. They had no escape. You ran and you were up against another wall of flames because it was trees all around. It wasn't like you could get on, in your car and on a road and try to outrun it. You were stuck. The facts aren't always there. I love reading old newspapers because they are a hoot. I mean, they call a spade a spade. There's no two ways about it.